A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corin. So we chatted in a previous episode about Greenland and how strange it seemingly is that the US has suddenly taken an interest in what for many of us sounds like the ultimate barren wasteland. And we talked about the population living there, the history of the territory, about which I think it's fair to say the majority of us know very little, or at least knew very little before this whole strange dynamic began making world headlines. But it actually leads to a bigger discussion, I think, or fits within a bigger picture, which is the militarization of the Arctic. This is one of those things that I just have such a hard time wrapping my head around. We think about the two ends of the Earth, the Antarctic and the Arctic, as just these big floating chunks of ice, essentially. We know them maybe mostly for the phenomenon of global warming, and we see those horrible images sometimes of these coolants for the world receding and the adorable penguins being pushed back into to make sure they don't go into the freezing water. But that's about, I think, what most people know or think about the Arctic, minus the great adventurers and all that stuff, which we should definitely do an episode about how many people have visited either pole and tourism. There's still a backlog, Herman and Corin, even though we have done more than 800 of these episodes. But I'd like to chat today about that concept of the militarization of the Arctic, because I was looking at some videos of the world's most northerly parts of the world and places like remote Canada. And there's just a lot of activity going on up there in the Arctic. Russia is very active. And the question really is, why would any government be, spending so much time and effort up in that part of the world? I mean, not to talk about the logistics of keeping troops safe and warm up there. To give some initial context from our colleague in ChatGPT, it's that why the Arctic is militarizing fast. It is an operational theater, not just a wilderness. It's an ocean ringed by sovereign states with coastlines. EEZs, nuclear deterrence and submarines, make the high north central. Russia's nuclear sea-based deterrent is concentrated around the Kola Peninsula. NATO also has a lot of interest there. Melting sea ice changes increase both the economic potential of the region and military mobility, especially reduced ice increases the navigability. And this is actually a really important one, because it may seem like just a tiny bit of ice at the top of the world, but with these icebreakers, if it's easier to get through it, there's potentially lucrative trade routes through that territory. And multi-domain. Now and China as well is involved. And I'm just going to leave the parts where I don't have much knowledge or understanding there, so you can take over. Why Antarctica is different. In Antarctica, the legal regime is explicitly demilitarized. The Antarctic Treaty requires peaceful use and prohibits measures of a military nature. So I'm going to stop there with my show notes, Herman and Corin, because that's a foundation that really interests me. It seems like there is this regime in Antarctica that has, carved up the space to an extent for research, or given enclaves for research, but focused always on the idea that this wilderness or region is for scientific exploration and kind of this shared part of the world, whereas it seems like that safeguard doesn't exist in the Arctic, and now therefore we're seeing the strangest of sites, which is militaries operating up there. Strange to me, at least. Herman and Corin, I'd love to hear about the militarization of the Arctic. When does the dynamic trace back to, and what exactly is going on up there? Over to you two.
For most of human history, the Arctic was the ultimate wall. It was this impenetrable, frozen barrier that effectively separated the major powers of the Northern Hemisphere. It was a place of myth, of failed expeditions, and of a silence so profound it felt permanent. But as Daniel pointed out in his prompt today, that wall is turning into a highway. Daniel is asking us about the militarization of the Arctic, and it is a topic that has gone from a niche geopolitical concern to a central pillar of global security in just the last few years. We are standing at a moment where the very top of our world is being redrawn, not just by climate change, but by the cold logic of hard power.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, you're spot on. For decades, we talked about Arctic exceptionalism. This was the widely held belief that the High North was a zone of peace, a unique geographic space where countries could set aside their bitterest differences to focus on shared goals like scientific discovery and environmental protection. It was very similar to the spirit of the Antarctic Treaty that Daniel mentioned in his prompt. We had the Arctic Council, we had collaborative search and rescue agreements, and there was this sense that the environment was so hostile that humans simply had to cooperate to survive. But that era is effectively over. Today, the Arctic is being integrated into the broader, much more jagged landscape of global competition. The pace of that change is honestly breathtaking, and frankly, a little bit terrifying if you look at the sheer amount of hardware being moved toward the pole.
It really is. And I think it is important to start with why this is happening right now. Daniel mentioned the melting sea ice, which is the obvious physical driver. If the ice is gone, you can sail ships through areas that used to be solid. But there is also this massive economic and strategic shift happening. We are talking about trillions of dollars in untapped minerals, oil, and gas, plus the potential to shave weeks off global shipping times. So, Herman, when did this modern rush actually start? Because it feels like we went from 0 to 60 very quickly. Was there a specific starting gun for this new Cold War in the North?
It depends on how you define the start, but a real turning point, the moment the world woke up to the new reality, was 2007. That was the year a Russian expedition, led by the explorer Artur Chilingorov, used a mere submersible to plant a rust-proof titanium Russian flag on the seabed at the North Pole, 4,000 meters below the surface. It was a symbolic gesture, of course, a bit of 19th century style land-grabbing theater, but it sent a clear message to the rest of the world that Russia viewed the Arctic as its own backyard. It was a claim of sovereignty over the Lomonosov Ridge, which Russia argues is an extension of its continental shelf. Since then, we have seen a steady, calculated, and massive buildup. Russia has reopened over 50 Soviet-era military bases in the Arctic that had been left to rot after the Cold War. They have refurbished airfields, built new search and rescue centers that look suspiciously like forward operating bases, and deployed advanced missile systems like the S-400.
50 bases? That is an incredible number when you consider how hostile that environment is. I mean, we're talking about places where the temperature drops to minus 50 degrees, and the sun doesn't rise for months at a time. The logistics of just keeping those bases operational, keeping the pipes from freezing, and the fuel from turning into jelly, must be a nightmare. But Russia isn't the only one, right? Daniel mentioned NATO and China as well. It feels like everyone is suddenly looking at the North Pole and seeing a target.
Russia has the longest Arctic coastline, so they have a natural geographical advantage, and they have designated the Northern Fleet as its own military district. But the rest of the world is waking up. For a long time, the United States was accused of being somewhat asleep at the wheel regarding the Arctic. We have Alaska, of course, but our icebreaker fleet is famously tiny and, frankly, embarrassing for a superpower. We have exactly 2 polar icebreakers that are actually functional, and only one of them, the Polar Star, is a heavy icebreaker. And the Polar Star is over 45 years old. It is basically held together by the sheer will of its crew and a lot of spare parts. Compare that to Russia, which has over 40 icebreakers, including several nuclear-powered ones like the Arctica and the Sibir, which can smash through ice that is 3 meters thick at a steady clip.
That icebreaker gap is something people have been warning about for years. It is almost like Russia is building a fleet of heavy trucks, while the United States is still trying to decide if it needs a minivan. But it isn't just about the ships, right? It is about the surveillance and the ability to project power. I know we touched on some of this back in episode 7090 when we talked about the combatant commands. The Arctic actually falls under several different jurisdictions, which makes coordination even trickier.
It does. You have Northern Command, European Command, and Indo-Pacific Command all touching the Arctic in different ways. It is a seam in the military's organizational chart, and seams are where things tend to rip. And you mentioned NATO, which is where things have gotten really interesting lately. With Finland and Sweden joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Sweden's accession in 2024 was a massive geopolitical shift. 7 of the 8 Arctic nations are now members of the alliance. The only one that isn't is Russia. This has fundamentally changed the map. Before, you had these pockets of neutrality in the Nordic countries, but now the Arctic is effectively a NATO lake on one side and a Russian fortress on the other.
A NATO lake. That is a stark way to put it. But let's look at the other player Daniel mentioned, which is China. China doesn't even have a coastline in the Arctic. Their nearest point is something like 1,500 kilometers away from the Arctic Circle. Yet they call themselves a near-Arctic state. What is their angle here? Is it just about the money? Or is there a military component for them too? Because near-Arctic sounds like a bit of a stretch, geographically speaking.
China is playing the long game, as they often do. They released an official Arctic policy in 2018 where they laid out the idea of a polar silk road. They want to integrate the Arctic shipping routes, specifically the Northern Sea route along Russia's coast, into their broader Belt and Road initiative. Economically, they are investing heavily in Russian liquefied natural gas projects, like the Yamal project, because they want to diversify their energy sources away from the Malacca Strait. But from a military perspective, the Arctic is a shortcut. If you are thinking about ballistic missiles or submarine paths, the shortest distance between China or Russia and the United States is over the North Pole. It is the Great Circle route.
Right, the Great Circle routes. If you look at a standard Mercator map, the Arctic looks like this stretched out edge of the world. But if you look at a globe from the top down, it is the center. It is the roof of the house. If you control the roof, you can see everything and drop things on anyone.
That is one of our 2 allowed analogies for the day, corn, so use the next one wisely. But you are right, the Arctic is the ultimate high ground. During the Cold War, it was the primary theater for submarine cat-and-mouse games because the ice provided cover from satellites and aircraft. That hasn't changed. In fact, it has become more important as sensor technology improves. If you can hide a nuclear-armed submarine under the ice cap, you have a survivable second strike capability that is very hard to track. Russia's Bastion strategy is built around this. They want to turn the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk into protected sanctuaries for their ballistic missile submarines.
So, we have this combination of old Cold War logic and new 21st century resource competition. I want to dig into the resource side for a second. We always hear these statistics about how much oil and gas is up there. I think the United States Geological Survey estimated something like 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered gas is in the Arctic. Is that what is driving the militarization? Is it just a gold rush with guns?
It is a big part of it, but it is also about the exclusive economic zones, or EEZs. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which we call UNCLOS, countries have rights to the resources on their continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles from their coast, but they can claim even more if they can prove their continental shelf extends further. This is why Russia, Canada, Denmark via Greenland, and Norway are all in this legal battle to prove that their continental shelves extend all the way to the North Pole. There is this underwater feature called the Lomonosov Ridge that everyone is claiming is a natural extension of their territory. When you have overlapping claims for trillions of dollars in resources, you tend to want a military presence nearby just to enforce your sovereignty and remind everyone else that you are serious.
It reminds me of what we discussed in episode 751 regarding Greenland. The value of that land isn't just what is on the surface, it is the strategic position and the minerals underneath, things like neodymium and praseodymium for electric vehicle batteries. But the Arctic is even more volatile because the environment is changing so fast. We aren't just talking about a static piece of land. We are talking about a shifting seascape. Does the melting ice actually make it easier for the military to operate, or does it just create new problems?
It is a double-edged sword. On one hand, less ice means more open water for conventional warships. You don't need a specialized ice-hardened hull to sail through the Barents Sea in the summer anymore. But on the other hand, the melting permafrost is destroying the very bases these countries are building. Russia is seeing airfields buckle and buildings collapse because the ground beneath them is turning into mud. The Trefoil base on Alexandraland, which is Russia's northernmost military outpost, is a marvel of engineering, but it is built on a foundation that is literally softening. So, they are in this weird race to build infrastructure in a place that is melting away.
That is such a bizarre irony. You are building a fortress to protect a region that is disappearing because of the same climate change that opened the region up in the first place. It is like building a sandcastle while the tide is coming in, but the sandcastle is armed with cruise missiles. I want to go back to the NATO response. You mentioned the United States was slow to react, but what are they doing now? I have seen reports about the Army activating the 11th Airborne Division in Alaska, the Arctic Angels, specifically for cold weather warfare.
The United States is definitely ramping up. They released a new Arctic strategy in late 2024 that focuses on what they call polar power projection. They are conducting more large-scale exercises like Arctic Edge and Nordic Response, which involve tens of thousands of troops from across the alliance. They are practicing how to move armor and infantry in deep snow and extreme cold. Because the reality is, if you haven't trained in those conditions, your equipment breaks and your soldiers get frostbite within hours. Even the lubricants in your rifles can freeze solid if you use the wrong type.
I remember reading about how even basic things like batteries and fuel don't work the same way up there. You can't just take a standard tank or a standard drone and expect it to fly in -40 degrees with 60-knot winds. The technical challenges are immense. And that brings up the question of technology. Are we seeing new types of weapons or sensors specifically designed for the Arctic?
We are seeing a lot of work on long-range sensors that can operate in the unique atmospheric conditions of the high north, where things like the aurora borealis can actually interfere with radar and radio signals. There is also a huge push for autonomous underwater vehicles, drones that can map the seabed under the ice for months at a time without needing to surface. And then there is the communications issue. Most satellites are in equatorial orbits, which means they are very low on the horizon when you are at the North Pole. This makes high-speed internet and secure military comms very difficult. So, both the United States and Russia are launching new satellite constellations in polar orbits. SpaceX has been launching Starlink satellites into polar orbits specifically to provide coverage for these regions.
It is like a whole separate arms race just for the infrastructure, and we haven't even talked about the choke points. In episode 604, we talked about global maritime choke points like the Strait of Malacca. The Arctic has its own versions of those, right? The Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia is the only way in or out on the Pacific side.
That is exactly right. The Bering Strait is only about 85 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. If that becomes a major shipping route for global trade, it becomes one of the most important strategic bottlenecks in the world. Imagine a world where a significant portion of the goods going from China to Europe goes through the Bering Strait and then along the Russian coast via the Northern Sea route. Russia would have the power to monitor, tax, or even block that trade. They have already passed laws requiring foreign warships to give 45 days notice before entering the Northern Sea route and to take a Russian pilot on board.
And that is why the United States is so concerned about freedom of navigation. It is the same argument we see in the South China Sea, but with icebergs instead of coral reefs. If Russia claims the Northern Sea route is internal waters, they can set the rules. If the United States and NATO claim it is an international strait, they have the right to sail through it. That is a recipe for a confrontation. We've already seen freedom of navigation operations in other parts of the world lead to close calls between warships.
It really is. And the stakes are getting higher because the window of time when these routes are navigable is getting longer every year. We are moving toward a seasonally ice-free Arctic, possibly as early as the 2030s. When that happens, the Arctic isn't just a frontier anymore, it is a primary maritime highway. That is my second analogy, by the way. I'm cutting myself off now.
Noted. 2 analogies used. We are going direct from here on out. So, let's talk about the risk of actual conflict. Most analysts seem to think that a war starting in the Arctic is unlikely because it is so expensive and difficult to fight there. But the fear is that a conflict somewhere else, like Eastern Europe or the Pacific, could spill over into the Arctic. Is that the main concern for military planners?
That is the horizontal escalation theory. If there is a clash in the Baltic Sea or the South China Sea, the Arctic becomes a place where you can strike your opponent's vulnerable flanks. For Russia, the Arctic is where their nuclear deterrent is parked. If they feel that their bases on the Kola Peninsula are threatened, they might feel forced to escalate. For NATO, the concern is the GIUK gap, which stands for Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. During the Cold War, that was the line NATO had to hold to prevent Soviet submarines from reaching the Atlantic and cutting off the supply lines between North America and Europe. That gap is once again the focus of intense naval activity. We are seeing a return to Cold War II geography.
It is fascinating how these old geographic realities are reasserting themselves. We spent 20 years focused on counterinsurgency and desert warfare in the Middle East, and now we are looking at maps from 1965 and realizing the terrain hasn't changed, even if the ice has. But what about the people who actually live there? We often talk about the Arctic as this empty space, but there are 4 million people living in the Arctic Circle, including many indigenous communities like the Inuit, the Sami, and the Nenets. How does this militarization affect them?
It is a huge, often overlooked issue. These communities are on the front lines of both climate change and militarization. In many cases, military bases provide jobs and infrastructure, like better airfields or internet. But they also bring environmental risks and make these communities potential targets in a conflict. There is also the issue of food security. If military exercises or increased shipping disrupt the migration patterns of whales, seals, or caribou, it threatens the traditional way of life for thousands of people. The Inuit Circumpolar Council has been very vocal about wanting the Arctic to remain a zone of peace, but their voices are often drowned out by the roar of jet engines and the crunch of icebreakers.
It seems like there is a real tension between the national security interests of the big powers and the human security of the people on the ground. And that brings us back to the Arctic Council. This was the primary forum for cooperation in the region, but since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Council's work has been largely frozen. Is there any hope for a diplomatic off-ramp here, or are we stuck in this escalatory cycle?
Right now, the diplomacy is in a very tough spot. The 7 NATO members of the Arctic Council, the Arctic 7, have resumed some work among themselves, but they aren't engaging with Russia the way they used to. Without Russia, you can't really have an effective Arctic Council because they own half the coastline and represent half the population of the region. So, we are seeing a fragmented Arctic. You have the Western Arctic and the Russian Arctic, and they are increasingly suspicious of each other. This lack of communication is dangerous because it increases the risk of a simple accident, a search and rescue mission gone wrong, or a stray drone crossing a border, spiraling out of control because there is no hotline to de-escalate.
That is the real nightmare scenario. A misunderstanding in a place where it is almost impossible to send help quickly. So, if we are looking at the next 5 to 10 years, what should we be watching for? What are the benchmarks for how bad this militarization is getting?
I would watch 3 things very closely. First, the icebreaker programs. Watch to see if the United States actually builds and launches its new polar security cutters. The first one has been delayed repeatedly. If the U.S. can't get new ships in the water, the capability gap will become a chasm. Second, watch China's investment in Russian infrastructure. If China starts building its own naval piers or airfields in the Russian Arctic, that is a massive shift in the balance of power. It would mean Russia is trading its sovereignty for Chinese cash. And third, watch the Svalbard Islands.
Svalbard? That is the Norwegian archipelago, right? Why there?
Because of the Svalbard Treaty of 1920, it gives Norway sovereignty, but it also gives other countries, including Russia, the right to conduct commercial activities like mining. It is also supposed to be demilitarized. Russia has a mining town there called Barentsburg. It has long been seen as a potential flashpoint for a gray zone conflict, where Russia might try to test NATO's resolve by asserting more control over the islands without triggering a full-scale war. It is a unique legal anomaly that is ripe for exploitation.
Svalbard is a great catch. We should probably do a whole episode on that at some point. It has that same weird legal ambiguity that makes for great geopolitical drama. But to Daniel's point about Antarctica being demilitarized, it really highlights how lucky we are to have that treaty in the south. The Arctic never had that because it isn't a continent, it is an ocean surrounded by sovereign states. There was never a moment where everyone agreed to keep the military out because everyone already lived there.
In the south, you have a landmass that nobody owns. In the north, you have an ocean that everyone wants a piece of. It is the fundamental difference between a scientific preserve and a strategic crossroads. And as the ice melts, that crossroads is only going to get busier, louder, and more dangerous. We are seeing the opening of a new ocean in real time, and history tells us that the opening of a new ocean is rarely a peaceful process.
So, for our listeners who are hearing this and thinking, okay, this sounds like a mess, what is the takeaway? Is it that we are headed for a Cold War, literally and figuratively?
The takeaway is that the map of the world is changing. We are used to thinking of the Atlantic and the Pacific as the two big arenas of history. We need to start thinking of the Arctic as the third one. It is no longer a peripheral area. It is becoming a central theater for energy, trade, and military competition. If you want to understand the 21st century, you have to look north. The high north is no longer low tension.
It is a sobering thought. We have gone from exploring the Arctic for the sake of discovery, the era of Franklin and Amundsen, to fortifying it for the sake of dominance. The environment is still just as deadly, but our ability to destroy each other in it has scaled up massively. I think back to those early explorers who were just trying to find a way through the ice. Now, we are trying to own the ice before it's gone.
It has. And the environmental stakes shouldn't be ignored either. A military conflict in the Arctic would be an environmental catastrophe. An oil spill in those waters is almost impossible to clean up because the oil gets trapped under the ice, and the microbes that normally break down oil don't work in the cold. So, the militarization isn't just a threat to peace, it is a threat to the entire ecosystem of the planet.
That is a great point. The Arctic regulates the entire world's climate. If we mess that up with military activity or industrial accidents, the consequences will be felt everywhere. It is all connected. Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground today, or a lot of ice anyway. We have looked at the history from the Cold War to the 2007 flag planting, the massive Russian buildup, the NATO response with Finland and Sweden, and the long-term goals of China.
We have. And I think it is important to remember that this isn't just about ships and planes. It is about a fundamental shift in how we view our planet. The Arctic is moving from being a mystery to being a resource, and that transition is always messy. We are losing the Arctic exceptionalism that kept the peace for so long.
It definitely is. Daniel, thanks for this prompt. It really pushed us to look at a part of the world that often gets ignored until something goes wrong. It is a perfect example of the kind of deep dive we love doing here. It's a reminder that geography still matters, even in a digital age.
And to our listeners, if you have been enjoying these deep dives into the weird and the complex, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps the show reach more people who are interested in these kinds of topics. We rely on that word of mouth to keep the lights on.
Yeah, it really does make a difference. And if you want to dig into our back catalog, you can find all 800 plus episodes at myweirdprompts.com. We have covered everything from maritime choke points in episode 604 to the strategic importance of Greenland in episode 751. You can also reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com if you have your own prompt you want us to explore. We love hearing from you.
We are available on all the major platforms, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. There is always something new and strange to talk about, whether it's at the bottom of the ocean or the top of the world.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. We will catch you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from sloss